like the video and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
The U.S. strikes in Syria following the deaths of 3 Americans illustrate the enduring challenges of counterterrorism in a fragmented region where militant groups remain resilient despite military defeat. When viewed alongside intensified enforcement against Venezuela's sanctioned oil trade, the actions reflect a U.S. strategy that leverages targeted force and economic pressure to manage threats without large-scale escalation. Reporting from major news organizations suggests that while these measures address immediate risks, they leave unresolved questions about long-term stability, the persistence of extremist ideology, and the limits of coercive power. The United States has conducted airstrikes in Syria in response to attacks that resulted in the deaths of 3 Americans, underscoring Washington's continued military engagement against the Islamic State, ISIS, despite its territorial defeat in 2019. These strikes occurred alongside a separate but contemporaneous escalation in U.S. enforcement actions against Venezuela's sanctioned oil trade, highlighting a broader U.S. strategy that blends military force, economic pressure, and legal mechanisms. Reporting by outlets such as Reuters, AP News, and the BBC indicates that while the Syria strikes are tactically limited, they reflect persistent security challenges posed by ISIS and the enduring risks to U.S. personnel in the region. The U.S. military presence in Syria dates back to the campaign against ISIS, which seized large swathes of territory in Syria and Iraq in the mid-2010s. A U.S.-led coalition, working closely with Kurdish-led forces known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, dismantled the group's territorial control by 2019. However, as Reuters and the Financial Times have reported in subsequent years, ISIS transitioned into an insurgent organization, maintaining networks capable of ambushes, prison breaks, and targeted attacks. U.S. forces remain in Syria primarily to advise and assist local partners and to prevent an ISIS resurgence. This mission carries ongoing risks, particularly in remote areas with limited security coverage. According to aggregated reporting from Reuters and AP News, recent attacks on U.S. personnel have revived debates in Washington about the scale and duration of the U.S. footprint in the country. At the same time, the U.S. has intensified pressure on Venezuela through maritime enforcement actions aimed at curbing illicit oil exports that fund President Nicolas Maduro's government. While distinct from the Syria strikes, these actions form part of a broader pattern of U.S. reliance on coercive tools short of large-scale war. U.S. officials confirmed that American forces carried out strikes in Syria targeting ISIS weapons positions following an ambush that killed 2 U.S. troops and an interpreter, bringing the death toll to 3 Americans. According to Reuters, officials emphasized that the strikes were defensive and proportional, aimed at degrading ISIS's operational capabilities and deterring further attacks. The Pentagon also stated that additional strikes remain possible if ISIS continues to target U.S. or partner forces. Reporting by the BBC and AP News notes that ISIS, though weakened, retains an estimated 5,000 to 7,000 active fighters across Syria. These militants exploit gaps in local security and the complexities of Syria's fractured political landscape to regroup in rural areas. U.S.-backed Kurdish forces currently guard detention facilities holding roughly 10,000 ISIS fighters, a responsibility that Western officials have repeatedly described as unsustainable without international support. Parallel to these developments, the U.S. Coast Guard has seized or pursued multiple oil tankers linked to Venezuela's so-called Dark Fleet. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem released video footage confirming at least one seizure near Venezuelan waters. As reported by Reuters and Bloomberg, these tankers operate under false flags to evade sanctions and transport oil that accounts for a significant portion of the Maduro government's export revenue. Major news organizations broadly agree on the factual basis of the Syria strikes. They were retaliatory, limited in scope, and focused on ISIS-linked targets. Reuters and the New York Times framed the action as part of a long-standing pattern in which the U.S. responds militarily to attacks on its forces while avoiding deeper entanglement in Syria's civil war. The Guardian highlights concerns from humanitarian groups that continued airstrikes, even when targeted, risk civilian harm and complicate efforts toward regional stability. Expert commentary, including analysis cited by AP News, emphasizes the asymmetry of the conflict. While the U.S. maintains overwhelming military superiority, ISIS relies on ideology and decentralized cells. Mark Chandler, a U.S. academic analyst quoted in broadcast reporting, argued that battlefield victories cannot eliminate extremist ideology, a view consistent with assessments published by the Financial Times on global jihadist movements. On Venezuela, Bloomberg and Reuters report consensus among analysts that maritime seizures aim to constrict Maduro's finances rather than provoke open conflict. Chandler and other experts note that while Caracas may respond with rhetorical defiance, its capacity for direct military confrontation with the U.S. is limited. Some outlets, including the BBC, caution that increased naval enforcement raises the risk of miscalculation at sea. In the short term, the Syria strikes are intended to disrupt ISIS operations and reassure U.S. personnel and allies. Pentagon officials told Reuters that maintaining pressure on ISIS is essential to preventing the group from reconstituting territorial control. However, the continued presence of thousands of detainees and active fighters suggests that the threat will persist. Domestically, U.S. officials have reiterated warnings that ISIS-inspired violence is not confined to conflict zones. As reported by AP News, authorities have urged heightened vigilance during major holidays, reflecting concerns that overseas developments can have homeland security implications. The Venezuela actions could have broader economic and geopolitical effects. Cutting off illicit oil revenue may further strain Venezuela's economy and potentially pressure Maduro's inner circle, as suggested by expert analysis cited in Bloomberg. However, such measures could also deepen Venezuela's reliance on alternative partners such as China, a point raised in Financial Times coverage of global energy markets. Several uncertainties remain. Independent verification of the full impact of the Syria strikes is limited, as access to targeted areas is restricted and assessments rely heavily on U.S. military statements. The long-term effectiveness of repeated retaliatory strikes in deterring ISIS attacks is also debated among analysts. In Venezuela, the legal and diplomatic ramifications of tanker seizures could evolve, particularly if escorted convoys or legal challenges arise. Reuters notes that while the U.S. cites long-standing court judgments as justification, enforcement actions on the high seas are inherently complex. The U.S. strikes in Syria following the deaths of 3 Americans illustrate the enduring challenges of counterterrorism in a fragmented region where militant groups remain resilient despite military defeat. When viewed alongside intensified enforcement against Venezuela's sanctioned oil trade, the actions reflect a U.S. strategy that leverages targeted force and economic pressure to manage threats without large-scale escalation. Reporting from major news organizations suggests that while these measures address immediate risks, they leave unresolved questions about long-term stability, the persistence of extremist ideology, and the limits of coercive power.